Hi, everybody. Some people know this. So my name is Tane Danger. I am director of the Westminster Town Hall Forum. Some people know this. I am an improviser by training, which is good because I don't have my script up here. But I am so glad that you all are here. I am here just for briefly at this moment to introduce what I'm very excited about for our musical opening for this performance tonight. We have a really amazing group that is here tonight and has actually been here for every single Arc Towards Justice program that we have done live and in person. So Vocal Essence Singers of This Age is a dynamic group of young people who sing, dance, rap, write their own poetry, their own choreography, and they're going to bring little bits of all of that to the stage tonight. They are under the direction of G. Phillip, who is here tonight to lead them. Again, they are an incredible group of people that reflects the diversity of our community, which is really a big part of what tonight is all about. So please make a really warm welcome to Vocal Essence, Singers of This Age. I'm G. Phillip Schultz III, thrilled to be with several of my favorite young people. There are about 40 of us when we're all together. We've got a good number here today to sing for you. That was a song from our South African siblings. Volo Volo. It's sung in gatherings like this, weddings, all kinds of celebrations. Now we share a little bit of Melody the Boar. We come together, which is what we do tonight, to celebrate you. So let there be singing and dancing and joy. We come together. We come together to celebrate you, to be a witness to love so true. We come together to lift you up. We come together to celebrate this love. We come together to celebrate you, to be a witness to love so true. We come together to lift you up. We come together to celebrate this love. We come together to celebrate you. We come together to love your strength. We come together to lift you up. So who doesn't like little Bill Withers, The End of May, right? One of my favorites. Grew up listening to Bill Withers back in Georgia. The next song, if you know Virginia Hamilton's book about the boy who could fly, the people who could fly, this song takes inspiration from those magic words, Kum Bumba Yali, Kum Bumba Tambe. It's a song that was written by Brittany Boykin with poetry by Brittany Kroll. They collaborated together to pay homage to George Floyd and all the other countless names of black and brown bodies who left us before their time due to unthinkable and unimaginable acts. This is Stardust. South African siblings is this sense of hope in the midst of unthinkable circumstances. What looks like on the surface a joyful song is a song of us crying to the Creator about AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, and why have we not listened, and why have we not learned? What can we do, Father, is what the song says. But we learned from our siblings there that even while asking those tough questions, we approach it with hope, with a sense of that joy that's deeper than happiness, a joy that is a part of a resiliency of people that cannot be stopped from this mission towards reaching justice and equality for all. This next song comes to us from an experience here on the Georgia Sea Islands. So we know the Sea Islands spirituals are different than the mainland spirituals. And this is There's Honey in the Rock for All God's Children. And we have 6 soloists. Anna J, whose birthday is today, is first. And then you'll hear from Essie, and then you'll hear from Avery, and you'll hear from Aurora, and on the other side you'll hear from Zola and Moxie. This is There's Honey in the Rock for All God's Children. Make sure the other mic's on. Time for one final song that we want to share with you that involves the stage changes you can see here. lot of our songs, including the one that we left off the list today, just for time's sake, are songs that we've either created lyrics to or songs that really speak to the things these young people are passionate about. And so in the midst of this song, you'll see something that they're passionate about, but you'll also hear in the lyrics a message they're passionate about. This is called Dance.
Good evening. Welcome. My name is Megan Gagefin. I serve here at Westminster as Senior Associate Pastor, and it is good to be together this evening. What wonderful music, what incredible energy from these young people. I'd like to welcome you to Westminster, to these spaces and conversation, and I hope that following the forum this evening, you'll enjoy moving about the building, touring the art, enjoying conversation, and of course, joining us for breads and spreads afterward in Westminster Hall. We've been honored to host the forum since 1980. I would like to now welcome Tane Danger, Director of the Town Hall Forum, to come join us here. Before I turn things over to you, Tane, to welcome Wesley Lowery and to lead us into this evening's program, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that this evening marks your last forum in your role as Director of the Westminster Town Hall Forum as you prepare to pursue other professional endeavors. In the nearly 4 years of Tane's leadership as director of the forum, we have seen the growth and the scope and diversity of speakers and partnerships, and a deepening in the way the forum is a dynamic space for connections and conversations. We give thanks to Tane for his energy and commitment to the mission of the forum, and we wish him well as he moves ahead to what is next. Let's offer our gratitude to Tane.
Thank you, Megan Gagefin. Thank you so much. Thank you all. My name again is Tane Danger. I am very excited to be here. Welcome, if you haven't been before, to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. Our mission is to invite voices of conscience to address the issues of the day from an ethical perspective. And we have done that, as was mentioned, for more than 40 years, right here in Minneapolis. And here tonight, this is our 4th annual Arc Towards Justice Forum, where we mark the anniversary of George Floyd's murder here in Minneapolis and the racial uprising that sparked around the world. So this is an important program. This is something that we do as an offering to our community, something to bring our community together around a really key set of issues and conversations that we feel need to happen. And we do it in an entirely free and open way. Tonight's program is free for you all here in person, those of you watching on the live stream. It's also being recorded. You will be able to watch it on the Westminster Forum website at any point. It is also going to come out as a podcast, and it'll be broadcast on Minnesota Public Radio next week. So this is all thanks to individual supporters of the forum. Thank you to everyone who supports the forum, as well as some very generous institutions that helped make tonight in particular possible. So I want to take just a moment to thank them. Tonight's co-sponsors for this 4th annual Arc Towards Justice program. First and foremost, the Minnesota Humanities Center, whose mission is to spark positive change by increasing the collective understanding of ourselves, our communities, and our histories through stories and experiences. We are so grateful they are our co-sponsor for tonight's program. Thanks as well to the Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers. Mabel has been a partner with us for several years, and they are also stepping up to be a big part of this evening. Thank you so much to Mabel, and I know that there's a lot of folks here from Mabel this evening. Thank you, Dana and others. And to the Minneapolis Foundation, who also stepped up to help make tonight possible. The Minneapolis Foundation has actually been a co-sponsor of all 4 of the Westminster Town Hall Forum Arc Towards Justice programs that we have done. And we are tremendously grateful to them for helping make not just tonight happen, but this entire series possible. So thank you so much. Can we do a round of applause for all 4 of those supporters? I also want to take just a moment because, A, this is our last program of the spring season at the Forum, as well as the last program of mine, to say thank you to just a few other folks who are here, because this is 100% true. I'm not sort of just saying this on my way out. The Forum does not happen without a lot of people who step up and help. Both here tonight, but then behind the scenes in a lot of ways. So I'll try and name all these people. If I forget folks, I apologize, and I will hug and thank you personally later. But to all the amazing ushers and volunteers who helped you find your seats or handed you a program, thank you so much. Keith Kopatz and Eric Adams, who do the technical direction, make sure that you can hear us all, that the live stream works, all of that wonderful stuff. Jessica, who and the reception desk staff, who I know maybe this isn't your favorite part of the program, but they collect your parking money and also make sure that you know where you're going, and they make my life so much better and easier. Mary Marielli, who works with me here at the Forum and is absolutely indispensable to everything that we do. Tom Northern's Cold, who's right there, and Doug Knutson, who's right up there, who take amazing amazing photos of these forums. Most of the photos that you see on either the Town Hall Forum website or on our social media are from the two of them, and they're tremendously talented, and they give their gifts to the forum. And finally, to the Westminster Town Hall Forum Advisory Board staff, who believe in this thing so much that they show up for meetings and they volunteer and they come here and make so much of what we do possible. And I will just say personally that they supported me and backed me for the entire time that I was a part of this organization, and I am forever grateful for them and for everyone that I just mentioned and everyone who helps make these programs happen. So thank you all so much, and now you should do a round of applause for all of them. I know I'm doing a lot of thank yous, but it's important. So also thank you so much to our media co-sponsors for helping make tonight possible. MinPost, a source of nonprofit, community-centered news, and you can find their coverage of Minnesota and the issues facing Minnesota at minpost.com. Sahan Journal, who covers Minnesota and is working to redefine what it means to be a Minnesotan by focusing on stories of new Minnesotans and immigrants in Minnesota. Thank you so much. You can find their coverage at sahanjournal.com. And Minnesota Public Radio, who is recording tonight's program and will be broadcasting, as I said, all actually of this spring's Westminster Town Hall Forums all next week. So if you missed any of our other programs and you want to hear them, one will air each day next week at noon on Minnesota Public Radio. So, tell your friends and tune in, because even if you hear it, sometimes it's wonderful to hear it again. So, thank you all so much for being here. I am going to, one last thing I'll just say kind of so that we don't forget. We are going to do, thank you, Doug. So we're going to open it up for audience questions in the second half of the program. If you're here in the sanctuary, you have a card in your program. You can put a question at any point on that card. You'll be able to hold it up, and our ushers will come and collect it for the second half of the program. We also, if you are watching online, you'll be able to do a question in the chat, and you can bring those forward that way, and we will try and write those down and bring those forward as we have time. And then after the program, we will have a book signing with Mr. Lowery right outside the sanctuary here, as well as our traditional breads and spreads reception where you can continue the conversation. So with that, I'm going to actually introduce now our speaker for this evening, which I know you all were waiting for. Okay, so again, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Tane Danger. Our speaker this evening is Wesley Lowery, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and one of the nation's leading reporters on issues of race and justice. He is the author of American Whitelash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress. It was an NPR Best Book of the Year and a Kirkus Reviews of Books Best Book of the Year. In 2014, Mr. Lowery went to Ferguson, Missouri to cover the police killing of Michael Brown for the Washington Post. In the years that followed, he chronicled the early years of the Black Lives Matter movement. He then launched Fatal Force, a real-time national database of people shot and killed by police. That database, which remains to this day one of the most reliable public data sources on police shootings, won the Pulitzer Prize, the George Polk Award, and the Peabody Award, and was named one of the decade's top 10 works of journalism. Lowery is the executive editor of the Investigative Reporting Workshop at American University in Washington, D.C. It trains a rising generation of journalists by partnering them with a professional newsroom to work on projects that fill crucial gaps in media coverage. Excuse me. He also is a journalist in residence at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism and a contributing editor at the Marshall Project. Please help me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Wesley Lowery.
thank you guys, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for the remarkable, excited introduction. No one has ever said the words American Whitelash more excitedly than we just heard them, which I appreciate. It is great to be here with you all. It's been a few years since I've been in Minneapolis, and it's great to be here and see some folks who I know, and I'm getting texts from friends saying, they've got loved ones here and other people who we know. And one of the great things about doing this work and getting to travel around the country telling stories is that you get to travel around the country talking to people. And so, while I've got a few things that I'm going to say, I'm most looking forward to the conversation we're going to have down here in a few minutes, and then also the conversation we're all going to have together. Because, in so much as I have any experience or expertise or perspective, it comes from having conversations with people like you all. And so I really appreciate you being here. I'll also say, just to echo some of the comments I'm following, I am first and foremost a journalist and someone who cares a lot about our democracy and our information ecosystem. And I will say, right now, there is such a need for us to support certainly our local news organizations particularly. And so it's really great to get to spend some time with journalists from MinnPost and from the Sazan Journal and from other places locally here. You all have an abundance of riches when it comes to great local journalism. And so I know all of you guys are probably proud supporters, and if you're not, I'd urge you guys to do that as well, because we live in a country where we get the news that we pay for, and unfortunately, we get the news that we pay for. And so the hope is that all of us will answer that call and the need for a more healthy news and information ecosystem. And like I said, here, of all places, you guys have some extremely strong, rigorous, excellent local news sources, people who are really working hard to provide the information that the community needs. And so I just always want to, whenever I get the chance, make sure to, it's easy being the national guy who comes in to tell you all about your own city where you live, right? It's not, I've been that person before, but I've also been the person sitting in the pew going, look at this guy who thinks he knows about this place where we live. And so I always want to make sure to acknowledge those folks doing the work day in and day out. What I wanted to do today is talk just a little bit about some of the work that I've gotten to do over the last decade as it relates to issues of race and policing and justice, which has taken me to almost every city in this country that has had any significant policing incident in the last decade, significant protest or unrest, or significant reckoning, which has meant that it's brought me here to Minneapolis a number of times in recent years. And to use that to set the stage a little bit for, again, I think the conversation we're gonna have and the conversation I'm hoping to have with you all. It's interesting, thinking about this week, I actually had 2 trips planned. I only did the second one, I only did this one. But on Monday, I was meant to be back in St. Louis, where the family of Michael Brown was celebrating what would have been his 28th birthday, had he not been killed in Ferguson, Missouri, August 9th, 2014. And, some things got screwed up. I couldn't get on the plane, but I had spent a lot of time thinking about this week that was going to have me there with Michael Brown's family about a decade after his death, and then coming here to Minneapolis just about 4 years after George Floyd's death. Thinking about the span of that decade, what we've learned over that time, what's changed in that time, what we've all experienced in that time, but then also the similarities between some of these places. And I thought a lot about St. Louis, where a place that I get back to a fair amount still, and Minneapolis. And a few folks who I talked to on the way in, noting how so often when a place is ground zero for such a big, traumatic, difficult event, that the wounds take a lot longer to heal, that things remain very, very difficult, that everyone learns the lessons of what happened everywhere else, while locally it can be very hard sometimes to sit in how personalized so much of what had happened when it's your city, where you have seen something that's so offensive, where there has been such pain and outcry. And so I've been thinking a lot about what the arc of St. Louis has been, as I've been thinking about now how to think about what Minneapolis's arc has been. You know, I got to Ferguson, Missouri 3 days after Michael Brown had been killed. And I thought I was going to be there for about 3 days. I've got a group chat with some of the guys who I watch sports with. They watch the sports. I sit there and drink the beers next to them, right? But and I remember telling them I was getting sent out on a Monday, and we had a Sunday football brunch planned, I think, or something. And I was like, oh, I'll be back by the weekend. I thought I was going to be in Ferguson for about 3 days to write a story about, you know, this police shooting and a community that was upset. And then in journalism parlance, and then I'd write a weekender. I'd write a feature piece about, like, what does this mean about the legacy of race in America here in 2014 and the age of a black president. And I read a little piece for the Washington Post. I'd come home. I'd see my guys by the weekend. And I ended up spending about 3 months consecutively in Ferguson, Missouri, and then spent the next decade really writing about issues of race and policing, covering the story of Ferguson, which became the story of Cleveland and of New York and of Minneapolis, Philadelphia and of Boston and Los Angeles and Seattle. But we didn't know all of that at the time. It was really interesting thinking back a decade ago, which isn't that long ago, but it's pretty long. We've lived a lot of lifetimes together since 2014. And I remember thinking back and getting there and all the things we didn't know. There was this belief, there was this feeling that what was playing out in Ferguson, Missouri must be hyper-individual. What was wrong with this place that this thing could happen? Is this place particularly racist or backwater? I mean, because I don't know about Missouri. You tell me, I don't know. I've never heard of this place before, right? That there was a subtext in a lot of our conversations and even in our media coverage of there must be something uniquely wrong. If only we can find the skeleton key that explains why this is happening here, then we'll understand it. We can sort it in our minds and set it aside. What was really interesting to me was as the movement that would be referred to as Black Lives Matter started spreading and growing, I would end up in city after city that would have some version of the same conversation. I was home in Cleveland where I grew up, and this was maybe a month after I had left Ferguson because there had been a video of a 12-year-old boy named Tamir Rice being shot and killed by police officers. And so I came home to cover my city going through the same thing that I had just covered another city going through. And I remember sitting in a church, the Word Church on the east side, so like 10 minutes from where I grew, from my parents' house, the biggest black church in Cleveland, and listening as the then mayor and the then police chief addressed the public in a forum that was called Cleveland, Are We the Next Ferguson? ? And city after city that would have some version of the same conversation. Sure, something bad just happened with our police officers, and like sure there's a video, and sure there are protesters, and people are upset about it, but we're not like them over there and that thing that happened. And there was actually kind of a remarkable dissonance that even in this moment that even as a city was grappling with the same issues, there was still this desire to negatively associate and to distance. Sure, we've got this problem, but it's not as bad as those other people, right? I've thought about that a lot. I've thought about it a lot over the last decade, about our need and our desire when we are confronted with something that so offends us or upsets us, right? No matter your politics, no one likes watching these videos. No one likes thinking that these types of things happen or occur. That when we're confronted with them, there is a visceral response. That we don't want to believe that what we're seeing is true or could be true of us and our society and the space that we occupy. And so in response to that, we have to decide one of two things, either to accept that this is what really happened and endeavor to prevent it from happening or stop it from happening, or to suggest, well, this isn't really what happened. I don't believe my eyes. I don't believe what happened here. I don't believe the narrative around it. People are using this. And we've seen these dynamics play out kind of time and time again. And again, what I would suggest is that it's very human in so many ways, and that response, even the rejection, does come from a place of not wanting to believe that such a bad thing could happen today in our world, in our society, with where we are, right? Someone said this once about political candidates, but people want to vote for the political candidates who reflect back to them the version of the world they want to believe in, right? But what we know is that very often mirrors don't show us the picture that we want to see, right? My mirror has yet to show me the picture I would like to see in the morning. And it would not be a particularly honest one if it did. And I think that part of our grappling as we together try to form and build a multiracial democracy, a multicultural society, is to be able to sit and look in the mirror even when it's showing us things we don't like. And instead of cursing the mirror, go into the gym, right? Which, again, easier to give advice than to take for here. But you know what I mean. And so I think back that decade, I think back to Ferguson, and like I said, we didn't know much of this stuff yet. I was a young reporter. I covered politics primarily. I'd covered some issues of policing and justice in my previous jobs at the Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, and other places. And I remember getting to Ferguson and starting to do interviews, starting to talk to people. And so I would go out and talk to protesters and demonstrators and, what do you guys want to see? What does justice look like? What does this mean? Why are you out here today? And we kept hearing time and time again a story about how this was an epidemic of violence. Black men were being killed in the streets every day and that no one was being held accountable. And then being a good reporter, would call the police chief and the police union and go to the Darren Wilson rally, and people would say that, look, this never happens. Most police officers never pull their gun, they never fire it. We never kill anyone who's unarmed or black, and if we do, they deserve it anyway, was largely what they would say. And we would write our stories up. And we got to the point pretty quickly where we realized that there felt like a failing in structuring our journalism this way. Either the police were killing people in the streets every day, or they were not. That our job as journalists was to try to figure out what was true. Not to write these articles about, well, Wesley may be 5 pounds underweight or maybe 5 pounds overweight, who knows? Our job was to hold the mirror up. And so we set out to try to answer those questions. And there was some naivete to that. I remember I called the Ferguson Police Department and I said, how many unarmed black people have you all killed in the last 5 years? And to this day, that call has not been returned. And we called the Missouri Secretary of State and Attorney General, and we said, what data do you have on people who the police have killed? And they said, we don't keep data like that. And so here we are, we're at the Washington Post, and so I'm like, all right, we're gonna go to the Department of Justice, and Eric Holder is gonna tell me X, Y, and Z, right? And I went to journalism school, and I know how public records work, and so there must be a manila envelope in a file cabinet for every one of these, and I'm gonna make someone go pull all of them and tell me the answer so we can provide some context and information here. And I get a call back from the statistician at the Department of Justice, and he says, look, we have a number for how many people the police kill, but if you use this in the Washington Post, I want you to quote me saying that I told you not to because it's not accurate. I was like, well, I've never had this happen before. What are you talking about? And he goes, look, there are 18,000 police departments in America. They are all locally run, locally controlled. Once a year, we send out a survey, and we ask them a series of questions. How many murders have happened in your jurisdiction? How many carjackings? And, have you killed any people? And once a year, about 300 to 400 of those departments return the survey. And that accounts for all of our federal information about criminal justice. I will tell you, having spent a decade of my torture, I will now impart this on you. The more time you spend with our federal criminal justice information, the more you realize what we don't know. We don't know the exact number of people murdered in America last year. We know how many people were murdered in the jurisdictions that filled out the survey. Right? And you can imagine the quality of the survey data probably gets worse as the question goes from how many people were murdered to how many people might your department have murdered. Right? A few more might be missing in those survey responses. Now, this offended our sensibilities in a lot of ways. I mean, a decade is a long time ago, but 2014 was not the Stone Ages. We all had iPhones. We were in a hyper data world. We knew how many shark attacks there were in California that year, how many barrels of corn there were, exactly what the price of gas was, but we didn't know how many people had been shot and killed by the police. And so we set out to try to figure out how we might come up with that question. Now, it was interesting when we started this, there was some blowback and some pushback on it. There was a suggestion that even asking this question was anti-police, right? That you're trying to suggest that all of these are bad and that all this, and what I'll say is that there was a purity in the inquiry, that we all want to live in the world where our police don't kill people, the police included. But how would we ever construct such a world if we had no ability to analyze what might lead to those scenarios or not? What policies might make it less likely or more likely? What loopholes were there in the system? Were people following their instructions? Were they not? Were they being trained correctly, right? Were there people out there who needed to be held accountable but who weren't? We would never be able to get to those questions if we couldn't start by looking at the whole and beginning to analyze them. And so we began by surveying national media coverage across the country, because what we learned very quickly, even with our diminished media capacity and with closures, that if a police officer shoots and kills someone in America, at least one journalist typically writes it down one time. One local TV news reporter stands at the crime scene tape for the noon broadcast and says, "I'm here at the scene of an officer-involved shooting." One local crime reporter writes up a brief based on the police press release or whatnot. So what we figured was we could set up what was in essence a series of complex and complicated Google alerts, and we could find every time there was a new mention of the police killing someone. And what that would allow us to do would be to go to those communities, to call those police departments, to talk to families, and begin building out essentially a really long list of all these cases. And what we ultimately found, what we ultimately landed on, was that the police were killing many more people certainly than our federal data suggested. Federal self-reported data says that there had never been more than 463 people ever shot and killed by the police in a year. We have found every year since we started about 1,000 fatal police shootings a year. So our data has doubled the number of cases at least, even in the lowest year. We found that while the majority of these cases were people who were white and people who were armed, which again, when we look at our national demographic statistics shouldn't surprise us. There are in fact millions more, tens of millions more white Americans than there are, say, black Americans. We found that when you start looking at the rate at which black Americans are killed, it is far disproportionate to their population, to their police interactions, and to what we would expect to see in this type of data. That we had a community that was telling us that it felt to them like this was happening all the time and no one was being held accountable. And now we had data showing that, well, yeah, every 2.5 weeks an unarmed black person is shot and killed by the police, and almost none of those cops are ever arrested. That thematically, what the protesters were saying was true. And I'd love to say that, that was the end of the story. We proved it and defeated racism and moved on. I don't have to tell you all, that's not what happened. We launched that project in 2015. It is still ongoing to this day. We spent years doing big, complex policing investigations and journalism. I wrote my first book about those early years of Black Lives Matter, including time I spent here after the death of Jamar Clark in 2015. And then we saw in 2016 an election that that changed a lot of the conversation nationally. I remember, so my first book came out the second week of November 2016, which was a very calm time. Nothing was happening. No one was, and you know, I'd written this book about all these racial justice protests in the Obama administration. And I remember thinking, I was like, my timing on this is really off because no one's gonna talk about this. They're gonna be talking about like what the first woman president's gonna do and like gender stuff and about like not gonna sell any books. And as it turned out, in the second week of November in 2016, there were massive protests all over the country around questions of who we were as a multiracial democracy and racism and nativism and all these things, and having developed some expertise on that, I was in demand in a way I didn't quite imagine. But one thing that's interesting when you write a book is that people immediately start asking you what your next book is going to be. And so here I was in the second week of November 2016, having turned a chapter. The chapter that I had been covering had closed in some way. That era of Black Lives Matter at the end of the Obama years clearly was going to change no matter who it was or what happened. I had now completed a big project about it and was being asked by everyone I ever encountered what was next. And so it gave me an occasion to really stop and think, what was my job going to be for these next 4 years? What did that really look like? What did it mean? What did it require? I was someone who covered issues of race and justice at a time where that had largely meant grappling with our nation's reckoning with what does it mean to still have such systemic inequalities and inequities in our law enforcement system. But now we had seen the rise of a nativist political movement that shamelessly and in fact proudly trafficked in a lot of rhetoric and policy that countered the vision that many of us, no matter our politics, have of what we want our multiracial democracy to be. And so as I sat there thinking about what would come next, I watched as the headlines streamed in. That outside the inauguration, neo-Nazis had gathered and were doing Hail Hitler right outside of the District of Columbia. That a Muslim woman in Seattle was attacked and harangued by white supremacists. That immigrants in Boston were attacked by two avowed racists. That when we get to Charlottesville, where a woman is murdered as in response to a long-going and ongoing fight over Confederate monuments in a city that at the time of the Civil War and emancipation was majority black, Charlottesville, Virginia. And it occurred to me that one of the stories of this moment, or one of the charges of what my job was to tell those stories, that my job for a long time had been to tell these stories of the systemic violence in policing and in our system, but that we were now in an era where we were also seeing a rising and complexified interpersonal violence towards people who are coded or classified as non-white. You know, I think it's worth noting anytime we talk about race, and it's obvious, but I think it's worth talking about that, you know, we know that race isn't biologically real. We know it's socially real. We know racism is deadly real. But we know that there's not actually biological race. We know that when we talk about blackness or whiteness, we're talking about a societal construct we have set up. And I think that's important to note, and it's important for us to think about, because we know that we live in a society, in part because of how we've set this up, that some people are forced to think and talk about race all of the time, while other people are largely uncomfortable with the idea that they might be judged by such a way, or that they might be accountable for what other people might have done or grouped in this way. And so very often sometimes these conversations get really difficult. There's a defensiveness around the idea of whiteness, who is white, who isn't, what does that look like? And I get it, I understand it. In part also because that definition has shifted and changed over the course of our history. Give me a different date and we'll tell you whether or not the Italians are in or out, right? And are they from Sicily or not? Because that also will complicate it, right? That we've seen over time how our country has shifted and socially to include and exclude people in what is our hierarchical caste system, as Isabel Wilkerson would say. And what we saw in the political movement that has become one of the most powerful forces in our society and our country in the last decade and a half has been clear, naked calls and appeals to that collective whiteness. A rejection of the integration that we've seen in the last 60 years. A fear of the other, whether that be an immigrant or a refugee or just those scary black people who live in the city. And what happens, though, and I'll end with this because I do really want to get down to this. What happens is, there's a historic study by a man named Gordon Alpert looking at prejudice, how it manifests, but then also how it turns into violence. And he talks about how there's a scale. How, because we also have to remember, we all hold prejudices, right? Where it's biological reality. I walk down the street and I'm crossing someone who looks like the person who used to beat me up in middle school, I'm gonna cross the street to the other side. If I walk up to someone who looks like my middle school girlfriend, I might stay on that side of the street, right? That we learn all our entire lives are risk assessment. And all of that risk assessment is definitionally prejudice. Is this friend or foe? Am I safe or imperiled? And people who look like us, who remind us of people we feel safe with or make us feel comfortable, we are prejudiced in favor of. People who seem different, we are naturally going to have a level of skepticism or concern. We're going to want to wait and see. Now, the task we all engage in over the course of our lifetimes is working against that, having more experiences with different types of people and being able to see the humanity in all of the people who we interact with. But what we start to see as you move along the scale of prejudice is that one of the key components to prejudice is when those prejudices are no longer internally held, but are now being externally validated and externally voiced. That, again, it makes sense that that person from a community that's a little different than me, that deep in my heart I might not quite know. But when I start engaging or encountering with, be it friends, much less public officials or societal officials who validate that fear, it then justifies it to me and allows me to start taking action. We move from privately held prejudice to openly voiced prejudice to action, to self-segregation. Well, I'm going to live over here. I'm going to send my kids to school over here. I'm going to worship here while you guys worship over there. Which then progresses to active discrimination. Well, I'm not going to hire those folks over here. I'm not going to buy from this place. Which then progresses further to interpersonal violence. And eventually can progress all the way to full-scale societal violence. That when we engage in rhetoric that dehumanizes people, we begin to treat them as less than human. It provides a permission structure. And so what I thought about as I wrote this book and reported it, which seeks to tell the stories of people who were victims of interpersonalized, racialized violence. Muslim Americans, Black Americans, immigrants and Hispanic Americans, Jewish Americans. What I thought about here and wanted to capture here was these stories, but also the context. There, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, are no new prejudices. These are all old battles and stereotypes and fights. And I think one of the things we have to do, and one of our challenges of this moment, is being willing to look ourselves in the eye in that mirror and to see the truth about what we're looking at. That none of us want to believe that we live in a world where what happened on the video of George Floyd's death occurred. None of us wants to believe we live in a country where someone whose political platform is unabashed and proud racism could be elected by tens of millions of our fellow citizens. But we do. And I think our challenge, those of us who are committed to a vision of multiracial democracy and a multicultural society, is to engage in that truth, because by looking at it in the mirror, it allows us to actually locate, identify, and carry out the program that helps us build the world we want to live in. And if not for us, at least for the children who are going to come from behind us. So with that, I'm going to take a sip of water. I'm going to wander my way down here to this chair. And we're going to engage in a much more interesting conversation than that. So thank you all again for having me this evening. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Wesley Lowery. This is the Westminster Town Hall Forum, coming to you from Westminster Presbyterian Church in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, Minnesota. My name is Tane Danger. Our guest is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Wesley Lowery. We are moving into the Q&A portion of tonight's program. So if you are here in the sanctuary again, you should have a card in your program. Please use that to write a question, hold it up, and one of our ushers will come and grab that from you, and we'll collect those and bring as many of them as we can forward for our guests to answer. I'm going to do a quick thank you for our co-sponsors once again. One more time, I'm so grateful. The Minnesota Humanities Center for co-sponsoring tonight's program, the Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers for being one of our partners tonight, and the Minneapolis Foundation for being behind everything we're doing here. So thank you to all of them. Thank you as well to our longtime partners at Minnesota Public Radio for recording and broadcasting all Westminster Town Hall forums. As I said at the top, all of these programs, including tonight's, will be aired next week on NPR each day at noon. Thanks as well to MinnPost, one of our media co-sponsors. I didn't mention this at the top, but I'm going to do it now. So MinnPost, a source of community-supported news here in Minnesota, they're also having their MinnPost Festival this September 28th, right here at Westminster. So mark your calendar, September 28th, and go to minnpost.com/festival for more about that. Sahan Journal, who does amazing coverage of new Minnesotans and Minnesotans of color. Please find their coverage at sahanjournal.com. So tonight's Q&A is going to be moderated by Kendall Harkness. She serves as she serves as Assistant Managing Editor of Diversity and Community at the Star Tribune. Kendall has worked at the Star Tribune for more than 20 years. Much of that, yeah, it's good.
A really long time.
Much of that career spent as a photographer and a photo editor, coordinating coverage of everything in breaking news, from the death of Prince to police protests and shootings to local events, including the Super Bowl and the Final Four. For more than 15 years, she's also been a photo instructor for high school journalists. So we are very grateful that she has agreed to do this. So please, one more time, welcome to our Q&A, Kendall Harkness and Wesley Lowery.
Thank you. All right. Ooh, you guys can hear me. That's awesome. Thank you guys for coming. This has been great to listen to you. I haven't seen you in a little bit, so this is great to get to catch up.
How'd I do? I blacked out when I have no idea what I said.
Yeah, you did just fine. You did just fine.
All right.
So it's interesting, the journey that you've been on for the last 10 years, starting in Ferguson and traveling the country. I was listening to you talk, and I want to talk a little bit about whiteness. And as we talk about how immigration happens in the U.S. and how people come, as we were talking about, like depending on what year it is and where in Italy you're from, that might be, your whiteness might be different, right? You might not be a part of that group. Talk a little bit about what people lose when they join sort of that collective sense of whiteness in terms of identity, and how does that affect their interaction with non-whites?
Of course. Well, that's a really good question. I mean, as part of it, right, I wanted to figure out in this book, I wanted to grapple with this idea of how would we define these, how do you define these terms? How do we talk about this, right? I think that they're, one, just from trying to be rigorous, right? I think it's a challenge worth taking. If I'm going to use a term 800 times, I might as well like have a working definition of what it means, not be like, oh, well, you guys know what I mean when I say whiteness, right? Like, no, I should be able to define the word, right? But beyond that, I wanted to actually there to be some rigor and thought into that. And so part of what I was trying to look at, and part of what I did look at in the book, was where does this idea come from in the American context? What is it rooted in? And it's very interesting, and there are historians and writers who've written a fair amount about this, but as you drill back, you actually get to colonial times before we're even a nation, where you see the concept of whiteness showing up for the first time in our laws. That in colonial Virginia, you had seen a series of rebellions. At the time, we were largely kind of a feudal system where you had rich landowners who would use indentured servants, former felons from Europe, right, and enslaved black people and indigenous people to work the land. And so you actually had a multiracial working class, for lack of a better word, who were literally building what became the first economy here in North America post-colonization. And as it turned out, all of this diverse set of workers realized that something was kind of screwed up in this system where they didn't have any money or ability to advance, and these rich white guys were like riding around on boats and wearing funny hats, right? Like, and so you started to see a series of armed rebellions that aimed at overthrowing colonial governments because of the depth of the what we would now call income inequality.
Right.
Right. Again, it was a little harsher than that. And most famously, amongst a number of them, you have a rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion, where Virginia is literally almost overthrown. And when they come back, they resolve to break up this working class multiracial coalition by creating a tiered class system, where what they do is they grant the white indentured servants an increased amount of pay, an increased amount of rights, to prevent them from having solidarity with the black and indigenous enslaved workers. And they write for the first time in North American law, into the laws, the definitions of, well, if you are white, you have these rights, while if you are not white, you do not. That we invented the idea of American whiteness. And what we see then is as we move into, from the pre-colonial period through the war into the documents we now have, we inherit much of the law and structure from those early colonies still in the structure, that we actually invented a racialized caste system, inherited that into our founding documents, including our Constitution, which had to later be amended to even grant full humanity to non-white people. Right. And therefore, what has happened is it has necessitated, since our founding, a struggle between the promise of our founding documents, liberty and justice for all, and the reality of the actual written policies and laws we have created, which say, for all, asterisk, as defined by are you white? And so what we have seen, if you look at the next 250 years of our history, it has been a struggle between the fight for people to actually make that for all mean for all, and from people who are the beneficiaries of the asterisk. And so, but what we've also seen, this will actually answer the question you asked me. I'm always getting there.
You'll get there. You get there.
What we've seen as new groups have arrived on our shores is people arrive, and no matter what marketing language they use, that they read in the brochure about what you would get when you came to America, they immediately suss out that we live in a racialized caste system. I want to be in that group. I definitely don't want to be in that group. And so what we see time and time again, there have been books written about this, as the Italians arrive, as the Irish arrive, as Jewish Americans arrive, as we see a process of immigrant communities acclimating themselves into American whiteness. That when they arrive, they're almost always perceived as being of a racialized minority and face, in many cases, overt discrimination. And what we see time and time again are concerted efforts, often by these groups, to implement themselves into and become accepted by the definition of American whiteness, and therefore affording them the privileges that come with full citizenship. Right. While other groups who have been here have no such opportunity to do that.
Right, right. And I always think about, NPR did this one episode about the loss of language and the loss of identity. And so those immigrant groups that come in generally lose their language. And so they lose their connection to home, their other home, and they lose connection to their grandparents and that piece of it to get into this one particular group.
That's right. And
have power. So let's go through some of the questions. This one talks about, let's get practical, about what can one person do in their home, in the community, to support this multiracial democracy that we should be in.
I think one of the things that's most important is that we all endeavor to actually live inside of the multiracial democracy. I think it's hard for us sometimes to grapple with the extent to which we still live largely segregated existences. And I think that oftentimes, no matter our intentions or our desires, right, very few of us, because of the way our lives are sorted, spend that much time interacting, much less interacting intimately with people who are actually deeply different than us, right?
Yeah.
And I think I think a lot about the last book that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote before his assassination in '68, or maybe published in '67, was called "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" And his question was, all right, we've passed the Voting Rights Act. We now have an ostensible multiracial democracy. For the first time in American history, everyone here under letter of the law is allowed to vote. We can have conversations about how true that actually was separately, but for the first time, I remember when I was writing a piece about John Lewis after his death and talking to Jesse Jackson about this, and he goes, look, those martyrs on Selma were our founding fathers. There was not a multiracial democracy prior to the Voting Rights Act. We lived in a explicit racial caste system and then a racial apartheid state post-emancipation. Yep. Our democracy is like 60 years old. Our multiracial democracy is like 60 years old. It was not one before that. And so King was asking this question of, all right, our choices here. So now we're all here, and we all get to participate, kind of. Our choice is either to be in real community with each other or to have chaos. And what I would suggest is that we didn't make the good choice. I'm not saying every one of us individually. I'm not saying that none of this is to erase deep work that has happened and deep improvements that have happened, right? But that part of what we have to think about and we have to grapple with is what does it look like and what does it mean to actually be in community with each other? Right. It's one of the reasons I love spaces like this. I think more of them need to exist, right? I was mentioning this to someone earlier, right? The idea of the people who I'm in community with, whether my family or my friends, It's like I show up, we talk about something controversial, I yell at them about how they're wrong for an hour, and then I say, all right, so same time next week here?
Right, right.
And that is in fact community. Our community is not actually based on agreeing on all the things. These people are idiots. My closest friends, right? Right? You know what I mean? Like, you're like, no, they're wrong about everything.
Yeah.
And that's why we will smile and get animated and talk about it, and and at the end of it, we will have heard each other and better understand each other, and maybe begrudgingly admit, like, all right, maybe I had a point about that one thing. Well, then I prepare my better argument for the next week, right? For us, if we are going to be an actual multiracial democracy and multicultural society, that requires of us to be pretty constantly uncomfortable. Because it requires of us to constantly be around people who believe the complete opposite of us on everything,
Right.
and just don't seem to understand anything about what we've been through or what our experiences are like.
Yeah.
And us finding a way to coexist without disparaging each other, running away from each other, discriminating against each other, or committing violence against each other. I remember I did a piece a few years ago about Trevor Noah, the former Daily Show host. He's from South Africa. And I was talking to him at the time about, this was not long after George Floyd's death, this must have been 2021. And I was talking to him about, or maybe it was 2020 still. And I was talking to him about, you know, would it make sense to have some type of Truth and Reconciliation Commission or you know,
Right.
something along the lines of it? And we were talking about it. And but one of the things he said was, he goes, you know, we often very blindly praise the idea of the melting pot without thinking about what it means. Oh, we're a melting pot, we're a melting pot, we're a melting pot. And he said, well, but doesn't that sound terrible? So we're all in a pot together being burned alive? Right? Like,
that doesn't
that
feel
we
good.
were these individual things and we are being literally melted until we mold together, losing our own identities and like that feel, and he was, I mean, he's a comedian, he was joking
Right.
a little bit. But think about that. It is actually a little easier to only be in community with people who agree with us, who've read all the same books, who like the same music, who have the same cultural references, who speak the same way, who define professionalism the right way, or dress the same way, or do whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. And I think part of what we're dealing with and what we have to deal with is what does it mean and what does it look like for us, again, as communities, but also as individual. What does it mean to be in to actually be in true community with people who are different? Because that is going to challenge us in ways that are very different. And I think that that's something that, you said, even in my own life, I try to think about and try to work on.
Is it easier to be separate, mainly because most of our lives are lived with this?
Oh, I definitely think it helps us find more people who already agree with us on everything in more spaces, right? That there's always going to be some self-selection. Like, that as it turns out, I'm going to go to work with people who I have something in common with, the type of people who I work with. Like, we do the same thing, right? We typically worship with people of the same religion, not of different ones, as a general rule, right? That we're already going to have spaces and communities that are self-selected in some ways, one or the other. We will almost always live with and around people of our same socioeconomic bracket by the nature of what it means to live in a place, right? Like,
Right.
And so but what is true though is that we did used to have more physical community with more people who were more different. We spent more time in a grocery store that everyone went to. We spent more time in a town square or a town hall. We spent more time in a physical church building where everyone here, or synagogue or mosque, where everyone here might share a religion in common, but let me tell you, as the grandson of a black Baptist minister and the grandson of a white Baptist minister, I can tell you deeply how being of the same religion and of the same denomination, or even the same household, can drastically shift and change, be it your politics or your beliefs or your applications, right? And so what we lose when we lose the physical community that we are in these ways, and the ability to so select what communities we want to be in and what they're not. You know, there was a famous book by a man named Bill Bishop called The Great Sort, and he writes about how across the 90s and the 2000s, how we literally geographically sorted ourselves into worlds where we don't exist in the same places as people who believe differently than us. Right? That there are in fact fewer swing counties than ever before basically in American history. We either live in a blue place or we live in a red place. And we've constructed our lives to basically not have to interact with those other people. And when we do, it's like an event and we have to alert everyone. Like I ran into one of them, right? Like,
oh my God.
Right? And it starts to manifest, and again, I don't even say any of that as criticism.
It just is.
We live where we want to live and how we want to live, and our lives mean our values. I live in the District of Columbia, in part because I want to live in a diverse urban environment that reflects my values and my comfort, where I want to be, the people I want to be around, what that looks like, what that feels like, right? If I were a gun owner, I would probably live in Virginia, since it's almost impossible to carry a gun in DC.
Right.
Right, and so we start to see if I'm someone who wants to do yoga or follow a vegan diet, I'm going to certainly live in a place where I have access to that. I'm now a dog owner. I got to live somewhere that has a dog. Like, we sort ourselves based on what our needs are in our lives, right? But so often now, many of as we think a lot about what it means to live our politics, or as our politics show up in all of these other places, in our food and what brands we buy and what we want to live, what we want to do and what we don't, it starts to influence what our sorting looks like and what it doesn't as well. And so I think all of it is, it's really difficult, but it really is this question of I don't think we've answered it. What does it mean for us to actually build a real multiracial community? And I think that's the work we've got to figure out how to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So over the past 10 years, with the reporting that you've done, with the work that you've done, with the research that you've done, now you're a teacher, you're teaching our
Some
young
days.
people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pray for them.
Good luck, good luck. What are you trying to impart to them in terms of not only the craft, but about our democracy and what they need to know to be prepared as young adults?
I think that, for me, I think in journalism we're in an era that's very similar to the post-Watergate moment. Watergate changed American journalism, and one of the ways it did that was it propelled a generation and 2 generations of American journalists who said, I want to change the world, I want to defend democracy, and the way I'm going to do it is by journalism. It helped create a public perception of the journalist as a frontline defender of democracy, as someone who could take down a president by knocking on a few doors, right? Again, what happened in the movie isn't exactly how it happened, right? But I think we're at a moment that's very similar to that. We have a more diverse, energetic set of young people coming into journalism schools across the country because they think the climate is dying and they want to stop that from happening.
Right.
Because they watched a man be murdered on video and they don't want to live in a society like that. Because they were at the Women's March and they've been sharing stories about how men have been treating them. And so we have young people who are saying, I want to do something about the world as it is. They've looked in the mirror, they've assessed what they see, and they go, no, all right, let's have a plan, let's do something.
Right.
And my plan is I'm going to detail even further all the ways we're screwed up to empower us to fix it.
Right.
Journalism, right? And I think that I think sometimes as journalists, we can be a little, we can be a little too quickly dismissive of that energy and that excitement. That when someone sees something happening in the world and their inclination is to run towards the chaos, to me, that's a journalist.
Right.
Right? And too often we try to beat that out of the young people. Right? But beyond that, there's a quote from Dean Baquet, who was the editor of the New York Times, that I steal and use in most times when I'm talking, where he says that every generation gets to build its own journalism. this generation is going to get to build its own journalism. I have no idea what it's going to look like. By the time they build it, I probably shouldn't weigh in. I'm not going to be one of the old heads who's going to be mean to the kids.
Yeah.
They're in charge. But I think for us, I think for me, I think there are two things that I try to impart. The first is I remember, I got into journalism really young. I moved to Cleveland when I was in 8th grade, saw an ad on the scrolling television in the corner of the cafeteria that said there was a newspaper club. I had no friends. I thought, I know how newspapers work. Maybe I can make friends. I made no friends, but I was on the newspaper, and then was on the high school newspaper and the college newspaper. That's not true. One of my best friends is from the middle school. I made like 3 friends. They are still my friends, right? But I remember, I worked on it in the 8th grade paper, and it was mostly about, writing a lot of op-eds about why we should get 4 minutes between classes and not 3 and that type of thing, right? And I went to high school, and I worked for this journalism teacher named Natalie Sikiski, who's still the journalism teacher at Shaker Heights High School. And she was teaching us reporting, what that looked like, to call people, to do, right? And I remember being like, wait a second, wait. So I could start the day with a question, call as many people as I want who are smarter than me, ask them that question, steal all the smart things they know, write them down, and then that is my job.
Exactly.
And you pay me to do that. Because my mom says that makes me a brat and a know-it-all. but wait, no. I get to have any question in the world, call anyone I want on the phone and ask them that question, then write down what they said and get paid. And to me, that sounded like cheating. It sounded like the best job in the world.
Yeah.
And it is the best job in the world. And so what I tell my students, first of all, is that our job starts with a question. I may think I know parts of the answer. I may have a smart, educated, not even guess. I may have a lot of expertise where I'm pretty sure. But my work still starts with the question. And I'm willing to hear all of the things that might make it complex or nuanced or complicated. Yeah. That doesn't mean that when I get a clear answer, I pretend that the answer is not clear. But I also am willing to engage the things that might be difficult or complicating or complex. Right. The second thing, and this ties in, is that our devotion, above all else, is to rigor. Is to, I think part of what's hard, I've written this before, is that I think one of the reasons, there are many, but I think one of the reasons we deal with such distrust is that so many of us encounter so much news and information that actually isn't very trustworthy.
Right.
The first 10 links my grandmother sees on her Facebook page today, she should not believe probably any of them. Maybe 1 in the 10. Maybe, but send it to me first, Grandma, please. We've created we have an information ecosystem where all of us are constantly encountering objectively false information, but even more so very often, deeply incomplete information. Things that are written before the questions are all answered or before people could be contacted or commented. Yeah. I'm not even that big of a public figure, but my name appears in a fair number of articles, the vast majority of which no one has ever called me. Right. Right. I don't trust the internet about how old I am. It's got 18 different ages. Or my name's not spelled correctly. Or this big, and you obviously get really annoyed about that when it's you, right? But what I will say is, and I say this to my students, and I say this to other groups, right? Think about a time where a community that you knew intimately, or an issue or incident you knew about intimately, was written about in the press. And I always ask my students at the beginning of class, I say, how many of you have had that? And most people have their hand, there was the time the middle school principal got arrested, or the time that this thing happened, or the time that at my church we had. And I go, what did you and the other members of that community think of that coverage? And they're almost like, yeah, they got it completely wrong. I mean, there were true facts in there, but what actually happened was this, right? What was really, now look, some of that is all of our own defensiveness, right? No story about me will ever be accurate. I will always be mad about it, right? But what is true is we understand, as practitioners we understand, the deep limitations to the task at hand, and often the speed at which we are moving. Correct. That we often don't, it's what I loved when I finally got to do what we would call investigative journalism or enterprise journalism, more in depth, where I was like, wait, I actually get to not publish this until I have answers to all of the questions. It's not how much information can I find out by 5 p.m. and then never ask these questions again. It's, wait, but if this main character hasn't returned my call yet, I don't just put this on the internet, right? Like, and what I will say is, and it's not malice, it's the economic realities, it's the inheriting what we used to have, where we would, we would get it a little bit right on Tuesday, and then by Wednesday's paper we'd correct it a little bit, or we'd have it in the 5 p.m. news, and by 7 we'd know a little bit more. Our news was actually much less immediate and much more episodic that way. Correct. While today, within 1 minute, my hyper-incomplete thing can be seen by the entire world. And there's no putting it back in no one's coming back at 7 for the update. And so I think that one of the things I really stress with my young people, again, and I run like an investigative lab, and so that makes it a little easy, it is what we want to focus on is the rigor. Did we really call all these people? And not call them hoping they didn't respond so we could say we tried, but did we actually in our process set out to get all of this information? This person says, this book says this thing, did we read it? Is that what the book says? Right? Like this person made or are we aggregating an aggregation of someone's paraphrase? And so I think all of those things matter, and I think those are the things I try to focus on, because no matter what their form, no matter if it's newspapers, magazines, podcasts, digital, no matter whether they want to be columnists or straight news people or wherever in between, we all benefit from going through the most rigorous processes possible. And that rigor is the thing that makes us trustworthy.
Oh, thank you for that. We'll have one last question for you.
I give long answers.
It's all good. It's all good. So with the book, you took the time and care to get to know these victims of these terrible acts, right? And the things that happened around them and the reasons for that. In the research, and like 10 years of going to places where black men have been killed, how have you cared for yourself in the process of having to expose yourself to people who look like you, having to deal with these terrible things happening?
If I'm being honest, pretty poorly.
And that's a true journalist answer, yes?
I think that there's something I spend a lot of time now thinking about, and that I spent less time at the time initially thinking about. I think for me, I think there are a few things, and there's a double-edged sword to it. I said this earlier, or I alluded to it earlier, and I say this to my students too. I think one of the things that is the best thing about working in journalism is that when something that offends your morality or your sensibilities is in front of you, you have something to do. You know, one of the reasons all those videos went viral and those hashtags went viral and people saw everything was that in the moment that they were encountering a murder on tape in their city, or someone who looked like them, people wanted to do something, and they didn't know what to do. They'd know, and so they shared. They talked about it. They condemned it. And that didn't feel good necessarily. I mean, no one felt like they had done their duty to the world, but there was this sense of like, I got to do something. Again, I don't say this is a criticism at all, right? Like, it's a natural. You see something that offends you, and you're like, no, I'm offended. I don't want this.
Yeah.
What I've always said is that in journalism, what I always appreciated was that in those moments I had something to do. To make a phone call, to grab a notebook, to go to a place, to interview, to help other people understand, to answer questions, right? I do also understand that, I've done enough therapy, that I understand that is a compartmentalization tactic as well.
Right.
That is a means of not engaging with the thing you don't want to feel or see. That it can become a professional endeavor. It can become, well, I have a role here. I can help fix it. I can do and so part of what I've had to do over the years is really grapple with that. What does it mean to, where do I engage and when do I not? I don't fly to every city. It's been very interesting to me as we've seen the campus protests across the country around the atrocities in Gaza. And for a large portion of my career, I would have been the person whose job it would have been to get on the airplane and be in those places. And it's very interesting now as I grapple with how I engage these stories or think about them or how closely I even follow them, if I'm not going to be the one, if I don't actually have to communicate about it in public. I think for me, like I said, it's been working really hard to have some sense of boundaries around some of those, what I lean into, what I don't. I don't watch a video if I'm not writing about it, because I have watched my share.
Correct.
And done my work. Thinking about where my voice is needed and where it isn't, or where my voice is the right voice. But then also, and I say this to my students, and again, it's much easier said than done, that you've got to be a healthy human, a healthy person, to be a healthy journalist and do great journalism. That because it is a task that is very human. It requires us to be able to empathize with people, to have patience with people, to hear what they're attempting to say, even if sometimes it's not what they're actually saying literally, right? To have the humility to know what we don't know, and to guess for our own blind spots. And so because of that, and again, it's something I've focused on a lot more, is what does it mean to turn off, to not overload, and not overcommit, to not get on this airplane if I don't need to get on this airplane, because knowing that there will be one I need to get on in 2 days or 3 days or 4 days. Right. And I think that part of it is important, right? It's a hard balance to strike. Like I said, I'm in a little bit of a different position because it is my job to engage the things publicly. That I know when I set up a boundary, like I'm not going to watch every video. It's because I've watched 2,000 of them, right? Like it's not a oh, well, I don't need to see this. Like, I am too engaged in the public square. Right. But I do think about that. This thought about where can I be most helpful? Where is my energy and my capacity most helpful? And what do I need to do to pour into myself so that I can show up as the best version of myself to then have the most impact and do the most work? And I think that deliberateness, I think, is really important. I also have a puppy and listen to a lot of vinyl records.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, Wesley, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and this has been a great conversation. And thank you guys for the fantastic questions. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you guys for having me, and thank you for those great questions.
One more, please, keep that round of applause going. Kendall Harkness, Wesley Lowery, thank you so much for being here at the Westminster Town Hall Forum. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. Mr. Lowery is going to sign copies of the book right outside the sanctuary doors. So they are for sale from Next Chapter Books. So please go grab a copy of that, and then there will be a line for the book signing. There's also breads and spreads in Westminster Hall. They are delicious and amazing, and it's a great opportunity to talk more, do a little bit about what we heard of sit with some folks maybe that you don't know, and talk to them a little bit about what they thought and they heard tonight. But for now, I'll say thank you all so much for being here, and we hope to see you again at the Westminster Town Hall Forum.